Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at this ASEAN Climate Governance Network Forum. My name is Kalanithi and I'm co-founder of Climate Governance Malaysia. We are the Malaysian chapter of the Climate Governance Initiative, and this is an initiative of the World Economic Forum. We are a global network of directors of listed companies, public listed companies, and our mission is to encourage companies to address climate risks and be climate resilient. IPCC wants us to cut our emissions by half by 2025, which is just in 3 years' time, to stay well below the 2-degree rise in temperature. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time to save our planet. So all our positive actions are so critical. The ASEAN Climate Governance Network was launched on the 14th of February this year. And for the first time, all Institute of Directors in this region have come together, and this is highly applaudable. Well done, ASEAN. And today's webinar is part of a series of 6 sessions. It's part 2 of a series of 6 sessions. The first 2 sessions were on how the climate agenda is going to affect public listed companies and SMEs. And the second 2 sessions are on directors' duties and governance. And the final 2 sessions will be on the banking sector and capital markets. So we have high level of dependency currently on the natural ecosystem. We are interconnected to nature, not only relying on it for our absolute survival, but also for our businesses and our business activities. And we are extracting everything from the environment, and many businesses are starting to demonstrate that they are now valuing very much ecosystem services. We are seeing this in business strategy, from ESG to sustainable development goals, to setting up on decarbonization targets, enhanced reporting and disclosure requirements. And of course, the far end of the spectrum is operating within planetary boundaries. And to note that much of our reporting is about the impact of the environment on businesses, not about how businesses impact the environment. For example, the chemicals and microplastics that we are discharging into the air and our rivers. So there's tremendous momentum in the private sector to increase accountability, what is described as unpredictable yet entirely foreseeable risk arising from the climate emergency, including rain bombs currently leading to flash flooding in built environments, soil movement leading to landslides, which I'm sure all of us, depending on which ASEAN country you're from, we all are recently witnessing this. And many directors and businesses are recognizing we no longer have a choice if we do not demonstrate the sustainability of our products and businesses. We will very likely reach the scenario where no one will want to invest in your business, no one will want to lend us money, no one will buy our products, and no one will want to work for us. So it is critical for us to mainstream sustainability, and many businesses are also realizing that they do not want their workforce to end up being their largest stranded assets. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a wonderful panel lined up for you today. Thanks to our partner, the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, who have helped us curate and nominate the speakers and helped us organize. Thank you so much to Datin, Norazah, Mohamed Razali, Professor Mark Yuen, and Dr. Guan Seng, Khoo. It is now my pleasure to hand over to our distinguished moderator, Mr. Jean-Philippe S.Orbeta. Mr. S.Orbeta he's got a number of credentials, but he is the CHRO of AC Energy Corporation. Over to you, JP, and all the best. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalan. Again, and thank you for the great introduction and the background on the series. I think it's really very important that we are in this conversation today, and today's session is going to be very interesting because we will really focus on how do we make this happen. We were chatting right before opening this that there was a lot of developments in some of the education and awareness and all of that, but I think there still is a lot of questions on exactly the question on how do we make it happen. And we've lined up a great panel today. And maybe let me just start. You already mentioned it, but the format this afternoon is we will have Professor Mac, a good friend, Professor Mac, or YT as he's fondly called, will give a presentation on really some questions that we should be asking our boards regarding climate governance and remuneration. We'll then be followed by Dr. Khoo, Guan Seng, and he will talk a little bit about the impact of those principles and questions that Dr. Mac will be talking about, and really how does that affect now governance in general and also some of the regulatory questions. And then we'll end with Datin Norazah, and to talk a little bit about her own experience in boards. And then we'll have a very interactive conversation this afternoon. So I encourage you to use the Q&A box for any questions as we go through the presentation. So I'm not sure if the slides are up, but if not, allow me to call on Dr. Mac, YT Mac, who is a professor of accounting at the NUS Business School, National University of Singapore. He was former vice dean of the school and founder of the first corporate governance center in Singapore at NUS. He holds first-class honors, a master and PhD degrees in accounting and finance, and is a fellow of the CPA Australia. Professor Mac, over to you.
Thanks very much. JP, can everybody hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah, can you all see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thanks very much to ACGN and SFIA, and of course to Climate Governance Network Malaysia for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I just want to just say something about this report. So basically, I'll be presenting some of the thinking, some of the thoughts emerging from this report, which is part of a series that we have started with SFIA and CPA Australia. And the idea of this series, which we call Foresight, is to actually look at specific areas of ESG in depth. Okay, so in fact, Dr. Khoo, who is part of the panel, will be writing the second report, which is specifically on climate. And we will have subsequent reports that will deal with, for example, ESG issues in supply chain and other areas. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here. And the report, we've called it kind of integrating ESG factors into executive remuneration, because I see this whole area as part of integrating ESG into the business. And we think about the board's role, and clearly there are many aspects of the board's role as far as ESG is concerned. And one of the issues I think boards and remuneration committees need to now think about is whether, and if so, how they should link ESG to executive remuneration, and what aspects of ESG they should link to executive remuneration. So what I'm going to do is basically go through some of the key ideas from the report. I'm going to start with the 10 questions, okay, that we have included in the report. So basically the idea is that I came up with these 10 questions so it's an easy way for boards and remuneration committee to think through the issues of whether to incorporate ESG into remuneration policy. So the first question I had is really, should the company link ESG factors to executive remuneration? The answer may seem obvious, but it may not be quite so, okay? What specific ESG factors should be considered? Okay, if you decide to do it, what specific ESG factors? And what ESG metrics should be defined relative for each of these factors? And should you use quantitative or qualitative metrics? Should they be standalone, part of an ESG scorecard, or part of an overall scorecard? And then should ESG performance directly determine remuneration? Or should it be just a case where you modify the payouts based on ESG performance? Or in some cases, not very commonly, make a minimum level of performance as a precondition for even the bonus payout. So there are different ways that companies do it. Then the issue is how much should you weight those ESG metrics? And very importantly, should you incorporate them into short-term incentives, long-term incentives, or to both? Should you measure ESG performance against preset internal targets or external benchmarks? And then finally, I think very importantly, we see many companies today, especially in international companies, it has become quite formulaic the way ESG is linked to remuneration. But at the end of the day, the remuneration committees would still have to exercise certain judgment. So how do you balance objectivity and judgment when evaluating ESG performance? Okay, so those are the 10 questions we have included in the report. So I'm going to go through some ideas relating to each of those 10 questions, and I've combined some of them. So the first question in terms of should the company link ESG factors to executive remuneration? Clearly, the starting point would be, are there specific material ESG risks for the company, right? But I think the answer today for basically every company will be yes. I would say, but I think which are the most material ESG factors, right? I think it's hard to deny that there are certain ESG factors that are important to you, even if you are a small SME, which is not listed. If you have a customer who is an MNC, that will be relevant to you, right? And then but related to that, right, even if there are those material factors, are you able to meaningfully measure them to capture the risks? And are you able to set meaningful targets? So here I want to bring in this. In the report, we talk about a survey that ISS Corporate Solutions conducted, where you kind of see this tension where the institutional investors basically say, we want you to link, we want companies to link, but provided you can have specific measurable targets. Whereas the other stakeholders like companies kind of say, yes, we can link, and they are not so firm on that they should be specific, measurable. And then if you look at in the news, often you see on the one hand, while institutional investors are pushing companies to link, on the other hand, they say, oh yeah, but we are a bit worried that the ESG targets are too soft, and it becomes a way to inflate executive remuneration. So there's a tension there, which I think RSC and boards need to address. And then secondly, if we pass that question, then how should companies choose ESG factors and metrics, right? I think it always goes back to, starting from a robust materiality assessment of ESG factors, right? Which are the most important to the company and industry. And I would say that this same ESG factors should also be underpin the preparation of the sustainability report and be integrated into the company's long-term strategies. One thing I wanted to point out here is that I think companies need to avoid letting the choice of ESG metrics that you use in executive remuneration to be driven mainly by disclosures required by regulation and measurability. Today there's a lot of push by regulators to disclose. Certainly, climate disclosures is one area. I think climate. This is the topic we are addressing here. Is important for basically all companies, but there's also a lot of push to disclose like information on diversity for that. I think that's important, but at the end of the day, right, what is affecting a company, what is very important to a company, and we see that, right, maybe labor issues, right? So you also want to make sure that you don't let your choice of ESG metrics to be driven solely by regulation and also solely by what you can measure. Okay, and that's also a temptation. You choose those that you can measure easily, but they may not be the most important one, right? So I have this axiom that I put in a report. You get what you measure, but not necessarily what you want. So this is kind of something that Deloitte did when they did a survey of ESG measures which are used in executive incentive plans. You kind of see the whole plethora, right, of measures in terms of both on the 3 dimensions: E, S, and G. Now, the risk here, of course, is if you are picking, you can't obviously use all these measures, right? How do you pick, right? So the danger, sometimes you end up cherry picking, okay? The concern is you end up cherry picking something that may not be so relevant, right, to your business. So I think that's one issue that RSC need to think about. So one example would be Starbucks, okay, which we talk about in the report. So if you look at Starbucks, they tie 10% of the CEO annual bonus to environmental provisions such as eliminating plastic straws and farm level methane reduction, and then another 10% to retaining minority workers and other workplace goals. So what happened, the CEO achieved all his bonus targets and his total pay increased significantly. But what happened not long after, just a couple of months after he retired, okay, and retired in quotes, he was basically forced out in a way. After Starbucks employees basically voted to form their first union in the US, the company was accused of union busting and other labor-related breaches. So the question immediately, he met all his targets, he got a big bonus, but clearly it doesn't seem to, he doesn't seem to have addressed the issues which are most important to the company, right? So the question would be, did Starbucks select the appropriate ESG metrics? So then the next issue is, should companies use quantitative or qualitative metrics? There's often a push, and I talk about the ISS survey, right, which basically wants specific measurable targets, right? So where quantitative metrics are used, one of the things companies should consider disclosing specific targets, at least after the end of the performance period, and explain how they are set. I mean, companies already disclose a lot of targets in their sustainability report, right? But generally, we find that they don't disclose it in terms of remuneration. Okay, there was one company, I think it was Shell, which basically said that they don't disclose it before the beginning of the period because they feel that there are commercial sensitivities, right? So that's the issue, that whether some of those ESG targets could be commercially sensitive, but they disclose it after your year end in terms of what actually were the targets that were set. I think targets that are set should provide sufficient stretch, because otherwise investors may be cynical to say, hey, if it's so easy, let's go back to the Starbucks example, right? Eliminating plastic straws. I think that's a CEO can easily make a decision telling all the stores, you just stop using plastic straws, right? So is that something that is stretch? If qualitative metrics are used, I think it is particularly important for companies to explain how performance against these metrics is assessed, because once it's qualitative, it becomes more subjective, more judgment involved. The next two questions, basically the next issue is, how should ESG factors be incorporated into incentive plans? So basically, we see in the international context, we see some companies using standalone ESG metrics. So they choose a couple, and they use standalone and they put specific weights on them. So while these standalone metrics are the most objective and have the clearest link to remuneration, they are likely to be most suitable only for companies with a small number of material ESG factors, right? So the danger is, I guess, if you choose those specific metrics, one or two, everybody will focus on those, right? So how about those other ESG factors that are important to the company, right? So there's a trade-off between using standalone and using a more broader ESG kind of scorecard, right? So for other companies, a separate ESG scorecard may make more sense with overall weighting. And then within that scorecard, specific ESG metrics can be considered. So there are many companies you see that are using a broader kind of ESG scorecard. And some actually still have just an overall balanced scorecard. ESG factors are part of that scorecard. So these are things that I think RSCs and board need to think about. There are companies that, and we'll talk about a couple of examples, but that use, rather than linking ESG directly and say, this is how much of your remuneration is dependent on these ESG metrics, they basically use what is called modifier approach, which is that they basically say, if you hit certain ESG goals, you will get a 10% of your bonus, 10% extra. If you don't hit those ESG goals, your bonus will go down by 10%. So that's called modifier approach. Okay, so generally, if you use a modifier approach, right, it's always like that. From an investor point of view, if you say I adjust the CEO pay down, most investors will say, okay, there are no questions. If you say we adjust the CEO pay up, okay, because of achievement of ESG goals, you probably need to clearly explain it. Okay. So let's look at some examples, which we talk about in the report. So BP basically used specific metrics. So they have 2 ESG measures for safety and sustainability, each weighted 15%, and they apply it to both to the annual bonus of the CEO and CFO. So they talk about in their report, they say that safety is basically measured by process safety tier 1 and tier 2 events. So they say how they measure, and then sustainability is measured by sustainability emissions reductions in million of tons. And then the other measures are operational and financial. So the ESG factors account for 30%. Okay, and then for each metric, they disclose, so this is how transparent some of these international companies have become. They disclose what is the threshold that has to be met, the target, the maximum, and then what are the actual outcomes that are disclosed. Okay, they are all disclosed, okay? And then they disclose the overall formulate score out of a maximum. So it actually very formulate the approach. But having said that, the RSC then has the discretion to adjust the outcome, right? So the formula comes out, it may be 1.3 out of 2 or 1.6 out of 2. The RSC has the discretion to adjust the outcome. So, and then for the long-term incentives, the LTIs, which for BP, they are performance share plans. They basically have 3 criteria. 2 of them are still financials. And then the third is called strategic progress, that's 30%. And if you look at the strategic progress, that 30%, it includes ESG considerations. Okay, so they use 4 equally weighted measures. And you can see, if you look at those measures that I've shown here, you can see that ESG considerations go into them. But this clearly is somewhat more subjective, okay, how you assess these 4 factors, right? Chevron, another example. So Chevron is not quite as detailed compared to BP. So if you look at Chevron, their annual incentive plan includes ESG category of health, environmental, and safety, weighted 15% as part of a scorecard. Okay, and then they have individual performance measures, which are personal safety, process safety, and environmental, and then greenhouse gas management. Unlike BP, they don't disclose weighting for each of these measures. There's no disclosure of threshold, target, maximum, and actual outcome like BP. They do talk about how they measure personal safety, okay? And then, but what the company then does is they qualitatively disclose the achievement of those metrics. So they don't, it's not like, they don't have achieved specific targets. They then basically just say whether the overall result was, what was it? So in this case, for personal safety, they say met plans with some gaps. And then they did similar qualitative assessment, or they disclose similar qualitative assessment for the other 2 ESG measures that we see, the process safety, environmental, and the greenhouse gas management. But what is interesting in the case of Chevron, that's where you can have the disconnect between what the board or RSC feels in terms of performance, ESG performance, and what investors think. Okay, so if you look at Chevron at the 2021 AGM, 61% voted in support of a shareholder climate resolution to reduce all emissions. Yeah, so clearly, in the US, they have this system where shareholders can propose these resolutions, and 61% supported a resolution which was not proposed by management. So clearly there is some shareholder discontent there, even though the company assessed that process safety, environmental, and greenhouse gas management have exceeded plan. Okay, so that is the Chevron case. And then in a report, we talk about Danone. Danone also, they use this performance, they have this social, societal, and environmental performance measures in the annual bonus plans. And that comprise two metrics, which are actually qualitative in nature. So employees sustainable engagement and fulfillment of climate ambitions. And each metric is weighted 10% in this case. And here they assess that the performance on this social, societal, environmental was 100% was achieved. And they do disclose in terms of how they measure employee sustainable engagement. But you can see that they are kind of qualitative in nature. And although they do use some external benchmarks like inclusion in the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index. Okay, and they do benchmark against peers, like the rate of employee engagement relative to peers. And then on the environmental performance, the company said that Danone was appointed AAA score from the CDP Carbon Disclosure Project, okay, for the second year, making the A list and so on. So it talks about how the company has achieved in terms of the level of performance for environment. So it's kind of quite qualitative the way Danone does it. Earlier, I talked about this modifier approach, which is that rather than linking ESG factors directly to remuneration, like 10, 15%. So if you look at Unilever, you look at Apple, what they use is what is called modifier approach. So they basically, Unilever, of course, has this Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which I think ended in 2020 or something. Then now they have this Compass strategy. So basically they assess whether the CEO has achieved that. And when the CEO, they assess that the CEO has achieved that, they gave a 10% additional bonus. And then the CFO also got a 10% addition to the bonus. So that's a modifier approach. Apple also went down this route. They added an ESG bonus modifier to the cash incentive plan. So if ESG goals are met, the bonus increases by 10%. If they are not met, it leads to a similar reduction in the bonus. And the next issue is in terms of how should ESG metrics be weighted. If we look at the report, when we look at the surveys around the world, we see that the weighting generally goes from anything from 5% to 25%. I think the point here is that if ESG is important enough for a company to incorporate it into remuneration, then the weighting should be sufficiently meaningful, right, to influence behavior. We talk about linking ESG to remuneration, right? If you want to make it impactful, then it has to be sufficient weighting. However, having said that, right, if companies in the report, the view is that I express the view that companies that are starting on the ESG journey, may want to consider the lower end of the weighting, right? And over time, as they are better able to measure or develop useful ESG metrics, then perhaps the weighting could be increased. Should ESG factors be incorporated into short-term incentive, long-term incentives, or to both? Generally, companies should use a mix of STIs and LTIs. Okay, so if a company decides that linking ESG to remuneration is important, then the incentives related to it should be economically meaningful, right? So the point is that if most of the incentives for executives are through LTIs, then it's important that they don't link it just to STI. So this is the criticism that has been emerging in the US, where in the US, unlike in Asia, I think there's still generally a lot of reliance on STIs. In US, there's a fair bit of more reliance on LTIs, long-term incentives. Some of the criticism that's coming out from the US is that companies are linking to STI, but STIs are not that material. In many US, the LTIs are the ones that are very material, okay? And then but the point that we made in the report, whether to link ESG metrics to STI or LTIs may depend on the kind of ESG metrics. For example, for certain environmental metrics, they may be better suited for LTIs. Then on question 9, if realistic internal, so should you use internal targets or external benchmarks? So if realistic internal targets can be set through a robust goal setting process, then that may better reflect the company's context and may be more suitable. Of course, if you use external comparisons against peers and ESG ratings, external ESG rating, it could increase objectivity and could provide a more comprehensive basis for assessing performance. But then there are challenges, right? How do you choose your peers? How do you obtain comparable information? And of course, if you use external ESG rating, there are so many out there. Which one do you choose? And there's very little consistency among these ratings. So in the report, we talk about this Thai company, which actually essentially uses mostly external ratings. If you look at the measures they use, they look at the inclusion in Dow Jones Sustainability Index, FTSE4Good Index, and various ratings and CDP scores and so on. So that's a question that, again, RSC needs to think about. How are we going to assess it against internal targets or some external benchmarks? And the last question is, how do you balance, right, the ESG, the objectivity and discretion in linking ESG to remuneration? So I think the point that we made is that even in cases where highly formulaic approaches are used, and we see that now in some of the international companies, especially the fossil fuel companies, okay, the oil and gas companies, if you like, okay, the remuneration committee generally should still have the discretion to adjust payout. Okay, however, I think this is where remuneration committee needs to be mindful that there is always some skepticism among investors when you make adjustments, especially if you make upward adjustments. So if we look at Shell, so I'm not going to, given the time, I'm going to be quite quick in terms of Shell. So you look at Shell, again, they have a very formulaic approach. They have progress in energy transition, 15% weighting, and safety, 15% weighting. You look at how granular they go into. If you look at the last bullet there, when you look at GHG emissions, they even go into individual weightings for specific areas of GHG emissions. So that's how granular some of these companies have become. And then for safety, they talk about what measures they use. So this is what I mean by discretion. So what happened is, if you look at Shell, they were very transparent in the report. They said they had a number of incidents, 8 employees were killed. And actually they say because of these incidents, they actually made downward adjustments, okay, to the bonus of the CEO and CFO. And the other thing Shell has recently done is included an energy transition measure as one of the KPIs for the vesting of their LTI. So they have moved to not just on STIs, they are moving to including ESG measure in the LTI vesting. Okay, but this is basically a broad metric which is qualitative in nature. Okay, so very quickly in the report, we talk about 135 ASEAN companies in terms of their practices. So I picked the 135 ASEAN asset class company, which is included in the ASEAN CG scorecard. I think the last report was in 2019. I pulled those out, look at their latest ESG practice in terms of whether they link ESG factors to remuneration. So my view is that these are the best governed ASEAN companies based on the ASEAN scorecard. So let's look at how the best do it, okay, at the moment. So interestingly, we found that even among the best, okay, of the 135 companies, only 21 of them disclose that they link ESG factors to executive remuneration, okay. And if you look at what ESG factors they link to, one of them didn't disclose at all. They just say we link ESG factors, but they don't say what they do, what factors they used. For those that say that they disclose what factors they use, you can see that, so the other 20, all 20 of them included some environmental measures, okay? And then you have 18 of them included some social measures, and some of them included governance measures. Governance measures would be like audit and compliance findings, those kind of measures. Okay, so, and when we look at, and then most of them didn't disclose what kind of metrics they use. So 10 of them did not disclose at all. So if you look at the other 11, we see some, in terms of what metrics they disclosed, they were using quantitative metrics. 3 were disclosing qualitative, and then the other 4 were a combination. And in terms of whether they use individual metrics, we talk about like the shell type, BP type, right? Individual metrics or part of a scorecard. Many of them didn't disclose at all how they do it. But of the 6 that disclose, 3 have a separate ESG scorecard, and 3 have kind of an overall scorecard, which include ESG factors. In terms of internal and external targets, okay, we have 7, basically this 11 didn't disclose at all what sort of targets they use. 7 say they use internal targets, and 3 say they use a combination of internal and external targets. So basically, this is in a nutshell, this is kind of what is in the report. And thanks very much. Okay, and over to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mak or Whitey. Again, very interesting, very comprehensive list of questions, and a lot for us to think about. Before we go into the questions, I'd like to now pass on to Dr. Khoo, Guan Seng, and maybe just briefly in terms of background, Dr. Khoo has had over 28 years of experience in designing and implementing enterprise-wide risk management models, systems, and processes, and has served on many boards, and especially in financial institutions in the US, Canada, the UK, and Singapore. Dr. Khoo's PhDs in physics, material science from the National University of Singapore, and has also had academic positions with Nanyang Technological University, where he co-developed the first postgraduate financial engineering program and taught risk management at the NTU MBA program. So, Dr. Khoo, Guan Seng, please over to you. Some thoughts, your own reflections, on one is on Professor Mak, but again, your own reflections on how do we make this stick? How do we make the whole area of climate governance stick?
Yeah, thanks, JP. Thank you, Professor Mak, Whitey, and also to the organizers of this conference. Thank you for your invitation. I will try to relate my sharing with regards to the presentation by Whitey previously, just now. So the first thing we can consider is to go back to first principles. I think the challenge that we see today is that obviously there's a mismatch in maturity between what we call the ESG outcomes that could take multiple years to manifest, compared to the remunerations, which tend to be shorter term, maybe within 1 year, or probably on average up to 3 years in terms of the long-term incentivization as well. So the mismatch has to be recognized. The second thing that is driving a lot of the pressure on linking the remuneration could be the impact of ESG washing or greenwashing. I think that has to do with a lot of misunderstanding of what the term ESG means, because it is a convolution of many nuances and factors. Within E, there are a lot of factors. Within S, there are a lot of factors. And within G itself, there are also a lot of factors. And sometimes the E and S, for example, can have run counter to each other. For instance, when I was in Alberta, about 80% of the economy and job opportunities was dominated by the oil and gas sector. So if, let's say, the investor decided they want to practice an exit strategy from the oil and gas sector in Alberta, that would mean that you are going to probably cause 80% of the population to lose their jobs, to lose their income. That has a social impact. So the first thing is that, do we want to create an ESG matrix based on the combination of the 3 dimensions, E, S, and G, or is it better to look at the remuneration and bonuses in terms of the individual factors? That is something that the board and the RC would have to decide in terms of their risk appetite, in terms of the transparency of the disclosure and things like that. And Prof. Mark did mention that the ESG metrics adopted shouldn't be driven entirely by regulations or measurability, because some of the themes like the social themes sometimes tend to be more qualitative than quantitative, right? Number two, while the disclosure tend to be measurement centric, which everybody is trying to judge on whether it's benchmarking to an external ratings provider or some kind of measurement, the challenge for us is that we all know the ultimate target. The ultimate target is to hopefully, say we use climate, the E part, is to achieve the goal of net zero by 2050, all right? If that is the goal, and let's say we just focus on the E aspect, the environmental or climate aspect, the first thing is that we know that disclosure tend to be measurement centric. So measuring the carbon footprint, the scope 1, 2, 3 emission, there are methods for it together with the quantitative conversion metrics. However, the true way by which a company can evaluate your strategy is to look at how the companies manage two types of broad climate risk. One is called physical risk, which can be based on extreme weather events or chronic changing conditions like rising sea level. The second is transition risk. To actually tackle the 2050 net zero target, it means that companies need to start thinking about changing their business model, which actually requires a mindset change. And the board members and the senior management have to, especially in this part of the world, they have to deepen their understanding of what that mindset change transformation would require. Does it mean that if I'm totally going to move away from the brown assets or the dirty assets, should I do it immediately? Should I do it in transition in terms of like slowly replacing some of the extraction tools or extraction technologies with green methodologies and things like that without totally cutting off the dependence on the fossil fuels? So those are the kind of questions that have to be asked. And at the same time, how circular can I get to make my business? Am I recycling my waste? Do I have a measure for my P&L versus my waste management and things like that? So actually the circular method is very important in terms of the transition risk management, which actually would involve a change in behavior, some behavioral nudges along the way. And then with regards to adopting that transition management, whether it's energy transition or even transitioning to adoption of greener technologies or changing the entire business model to be to have a greener asset, that would mean your metric by which you measure your climate management also have to change. And now you have to link it with your remuneration. So perhaps the challenge is not so much the remuneration policy in terms of the current structure, but more in terms of how you adapt it to reflect the company's adaptation to the future changes as well. And then we must also remember, sometimes we get too carried away with the word sustainability. To be sustainable does not guarantee long-term longevity. In fact, to be resilient is more important, because if a company's business model is not resilient to extreme events or crisis, then how can you be sustainable? So the board members, senior management have to think about resilient features first. How to make the company resilient enough so that going forward, when it transitions to a new environment, it can be sustainable. Yeah. So yeah. I think I'm not commenting on solutions per se, but I'm probably throwing out more questions for discussions, I think. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Guan Seng. No, I think very insightful as well. And like you said, you raised more questions for us to have the conversation later on in our panel. But maybe let's just we'll move to ask Datin Norazah to share with us as well. And Datin Norazah is really with coming to represent or present the view of the directors. She's currently a director in the MISC group, which is an energy maritime solutions company, and of course, Sime Darby Properties. Datin Norazah was a consultant before with BCG and Booz Allen Hamilton, and so Norazah, over to you. Really, your thoughts, your insights. On the other side, at the board level, how real is this? Is this something that's really coming into the boardroom more regularly? What are some of your own experiences?
Thank you, JP. And well, firstly, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I look forward to having the further discussions as well with the audience. I see quite a large number here. So where do I start? For us on the boards, and I sit on a few boards, and just not with my companies, but also with other companies. The issue is obviously not straightforward if we listen to what Prof. Mark and Dr. Khoo is saying. So if we take just remuneration on its own, right? Let's park ESG first. Remuneration and compensation and trying to get that right on nomination committee, year in, year out, it's already a complex exercise. I think those of us who are on the remuneration committee, we can spend an entire day discussing it. So even when we get it right, when the time comes for the payout, we realize like, oh, maybe we should have looked at this factor or that factor, or maybe we end up paying more than our peers, or maybe we end up looking at some roles or some functions being paid more than others. So we never get it right, so it's evolving. And, a lot of research and academic papers are written on the topic of remuneration. So that's already complex, right? So we at the board, we have to deal with that and try to get that right. And this whole question of doing STI, short-term versus long-term. So you have that. And then you overlay on it, this ESG. And especially, I agree, the E factor. I think S and G, if I can say, I think most boards we may not say it's ESG, but I think we would have taken it into consideration, what we do with our employees, with the community, and in terms of governance. But the E is where I think for most of us is relatively new. Yes, we are aware, but to bring it down to the level of our own business, I think that's where it, a lot of us are still struggling at the board to get it right. So you have remuneration, which is complex. You add this whole climate change, climate transition on top of it, and you try to put those two together. So, complexity plus complexity, it just ends up to confusion and a lot of, complicated approaches. So I think for a lot of companies, because of the pressure to come up with a target, I think what a lot of companies do, they just put a target out there. And in fact, there was a survey that I was reading recently in the UK. I think they surveyed about 300 companies. I think that you can look up on this online. I think it was done by YouGov. And of 300 businesses, large and small, almost half actually have a target, a climate target. But when they dug deeper and to look at these companies, I think only like less than 30% actually say that they have the data or they have the means to actually do a baseline and then track how their progress is in terms of climate targets. So, I mean, what does that tell us? I mean, sometimes, we just put something out to just meet the requirements, but in reality, it's not meaningful, right? You're just putting a number out there. And so if it's not meaningful, how are you even going to link it to remuneration? That's even a step that you can't even take. So that's one. And then I've also observed companies who go the other way, the other extreme, where they go into this whole environmental target setting, and it gets very theoretical. Because when you do this target setting, it's an exercise. Yes, you can be scientific about it, but there'll be assumptions that you need to make. in the short term and also in the long term. Assumptions, for example, what technology will be available 5-10 years down the road. Can you access that technology? Is it going to be cost efficient? So I have to make all those kind of assumptions to say whether I can reach my target. So it becomes such a theoretical exercise. And for boards as well, when we're looking at the business, we're saying, well, you know, we're running a business, you know, we need to be practical. So why do we need to have resources doing all this theoretical, almost, you know, academic exercise trying to get to targets? So I think those are some of the struggles. You either just push a target out there, which you don't know whether it's going to be meaningful, or you go into doing something in silo that is no relevant for the business. So for the companies I'm with, we're different industries and different stages. So I'm not saying that we're going to get it right. But one thing that, at least to start off with this conversation, I think is the first point that Prof. Mark has mentioned. I think that's the most important. You will have to spend time to get that right, which is the materiality assessment. You need to understand how is it, let's say we take the climate aspect of it, right? How does it impact the business? What, you know, and how do you prioritize? Because climate can be big. And a lot of people talk about net zero, right? Okay, it's important. I don't disagree to it. But there are nuances, right? So one of the businesses that I'm on the board, I think you've mentioned that, JP, is MISC. MISC is in the oil and gas value chain. And what it does, it transports crude and LNG gas and other gases. So it's in an industry that's under the spotlight, and it's transporting all these hydrocarbons, all this fossil fuel. And while it's doing that, it's also burning up fossil fuel and emitting, you know, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, I don't know, what have you, everything's being emitted. So of course, you know, we cannot avoid looking at this whole question of getting to net zero and in terms of reducing GHG emissions. But if I take another company that I'm on the board, which is a real estate developer, when we talk about GHG emissions, yes, it's we can tackle it, but it is not immediate. So there are more immediate things to do in terms of climate. So what do I mean by this is, if we want to measure carbon emissions, for example, as a real estate developer, probably scope 1 and scope 2, realistically we can measure. And it in terms of relative to other industries, other businesses, it's actually small, because the most of it is actually in the embodied carbon, which is in the supply chain, the building materials, which we have no control over. We may be one of the largest players in Malaysia, for instance, but we have no control over, you know, the supply chain. So then you need the industry to be part of it. You need the regulators to be part of it. So it's a longer term journey. So if you look at what climate transition means for a real estate developer, it's probably something more immediate. Yes, you can have those emission target, but what's more immediate could be around, you know, mitigating against flash floods. Or you want to look at a circular economy when we plan for townships. How do we ensure that, you know, the whole waste management is done properly? Or we want to look at the effects of soil erosion and so on, which is linked obviously to, you know, climate change and so on. But those are immediate things that we can tackle while we take time to get through those whole carbon emissions. So the point that I'm trying to make is that that first question, that first bullet point that Prof. Mark has mentioned, to get the materiality and the priorities right, and to include that in the strategy. And it can't be an exercise that's done by a team in silo. It has to be an exercise that's done across the organization. Everybody, and there must be representative from across the business units and across different functions, because it has to be embedded within the organization. And it's not a quick exercise. So I can speak for MIC. I mean, they've done great work there, the team there. And it took, I think, to even get the targets out, which we've published it in our sustainability report, I think it was almost 2 years to get it right. And because we wanted to do it right, and for the board to sign off and say, let's put it out there, this is our target. So we have committed to reducing by, I think, half from our baseline in terms of GHG emissions by 2030, and to get to net zero by 2050. And there's a clear pathway. And it's not an exercise that you can do in a month, 3 months. You know, it's quite an extensive exercise. But once you get that right, and then the question of what metrics, what to measure, becomes a bit more obvious then, because you would already have a target, right? And then you're working towards that target. So every year there are initiatives you put in place. So for instance, for us to reduce our emissions up to 2030, we're saying, okay, let's introduce certain modifications onto our vessels. And what can we afford to do now? All right, so let's do it, and then let's see what's the impact in the next 1 year, 2 years, building up to the next 5 years. And then, of course, when we reach 2030, they were talking about potentially having vessels that are emitting zero carbon. So it's running on a different sort of fuel. So that's a 2030 target, and that can become a long-term initiative or a long-term incentive. And then once we reach 2050, the team is talking about, even not just going to vessels with zero emissions, but also carbon capture. So you're not only emitting, but we're also taking away carbon from the atmosphere. So there's a clear plan laid out. So at the board, when we're looking at the what metrics to measure in terms of environmental, we go back to that plan, right? And say, okay, so let's then just take and see which one is key. Of course, we can't take everything. When you look at the corporate scorecard, again, there's so many things. So you want to make sure that you can pick 1 or 2. And to Prof. Mark's point, it has to be, you must have some significant weightage. Otherwise, it's just putting it there to make a point, but it's, very low weightage. You don't even achieve it. You can still get your performance bonus. So we pick one, and that reflects the whole journey, and then that is incorporated into the scorecard, which is then linked to the CEO's pay, for instance, and then that is then trickled down to the next level. So which business units are actually going to help deliver on those targets in the short term, and then in the mid and the longer term. So I think, as the first step, while we tackle the other questions that Prof. Mark has said, I can't stress enough for boards actually to invest time to get it right, to get that first part of the climate transition strategy right. Because once if you don't get that right and you rush through that, you want to put something out there, chances are it's not going to be meaningful. It's not going to, it won't satisfy the investors, especially, or even the oversight bodies that are looking, overseeing the industry. So I think that's my ingoing view, and maybe I'll stop here and open up for discussions.
Yeah, and before I go to the, to start the discussion, maybe just a follow-up question on that. Should the direction of taking this really be management initiated, or is there a role for the board to sort of like really push management to think about these things? And I guess it's that question again, right, between management and governance. So your own experience, has it been driven really by management, or is there now a role really for boards?
Yeah, for the companies that I'm on the boards with, we're quite lucky because we have a management team and employees who believe in this and want to do it and want to do it right. So it didn't need a lot of push from the board, but it becomes then an iterative process with the board. The number of times the papers have come up to the board, across the different organizations, it's frequent. And the boards are really engaged because at the end of the day, it's us who's signing off to it, onto the targets, onto the plans, and so on. So management has, in fact, not just management, all the way down the organization, they see this is important, they want it done. For the board, I think it's more to guide and make sure that it's practical, and that it's, and one of the things that we always need to keep reminding ourselves is to incorporate that into the overall business plan and business strategy. Don't run it in a silo, because that's a big risk. You need to bring it in, so you need it to be part of your business planning exercise and your long-term strategy. Okay,
thank you. Professor Mac and Dr. Khoo, Professor Mac, you've been you've been teaching accounting and financial, and finance for many years, and Dr. Khoo, you've been looking at risk management and all of that. They're very strong bodies of knowledge with common definitions of how to approach, reporting and all of that. But as Professor Mac, you made a comment that unfortunately there is a lack of consistency in ESG measurements and ratings and all of that. How far are we from getting some global standards on reporting and on measurement?
Yeah, of course. Now there's an attempt, right, to have a global standard, right, which is the IISB, right, standards, to some consistency. But they are kind of starting with climate, and then later on they're going to move to social and so on. I take the view similar to Dr. Khoo, which is I'm not sure aggregating ESG is that useful. And I actually end of this one, I'm doing another presentation, right, where I basically have been saying, right, that actually CG underlies all this, is the foundation. And then you probably need to look at E and S and economic risk, right? It's really, we are talking about, and we must also not forget that it's this economic risk, right? All the disruption risk that companies or they are facing. So I kind of, to me, the idea of getting a single kind of rating that measures E, S, and G together, I don't believe it's that useful. I think that we should increasingly be thinking about each of them. Obviously, there are relations to the. I'm not saying that you should think about them in silos, but I think, the danger is that you take an overall ESG rating, you come out looking well, but you actually have some deep issues in either the S or the E. So I think that's I'm not a big fan of aggregate ESG ratings. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Dr. Khoo, any comments?
Yeah. Similarly for me, I'm not really a fan of combining all the things, but Datin Norazah did make a good point. The materiality is a form of prioritization, especially of the needs that have to be addressed, especially from the general ESG environment going forward. The challenge today, of course, as we know with transition risk, is that they are influenced more by non-quantifiable factors. For instance, with the invasion of Ukraine, you see that the governments in Europe adjusted their propensity towards the green energy path with the realization that they depended too much on Russia in terms of natural gas and the other fossil fuels. And they have to make accommodation for natural gas from other sources, as well as nuclear energy. So they are actually, they have taken a step back from their initial climate strategy, if you want to call it that way. So they are adjusting to the circumstances, which was unforeseen. So that's why I say the most important thing is to focus on whether your business can be resilient first. If it's resilient, it doesn't matter whether the crisis is induced by weather, by environmental, by social, reputational risk or something like that. It has to be resilient first. And then you think heavily about what would be needed to address the drivers of transition risk in terms of changes in regulation, disruptive technology, or even the sentiments of the younger generation, which may think differently from the current board members based on the age profiles. I'm not saying that we don't think about what the younger generation think about, but obviously they will become consumers of our products going forward in the future. So if you think about their preferences, do you lay out a strategy where you think about the various scenarios and then tied to resilience, perhaps you kind of think about how you would craft your strategy so that it can adapt to the various uncertainty going forward. So maybe some basic scenarios are very important for the board members and senior management to consider. But then the modeling of those scenarios become very important because it's going to affect the future of the company strategy. So, and it could be based on the materiality that was identified from the risk assessment in the first place. Yeah. So again, I'm just thinking about the tools today, and that's the reason why the network for the greening of the financial system, NGFS, you notice that most of their articles or proposals tend to be very scenario-centric because so far that is probably one of the fewest ways to address things forward in the future where the era is based on uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah, JP, if I may jump in, right? In the report, I try not to impose my own views too much, because the whole idea is to kind of generate thinking, right? But
Yeah.
you know, my own personal view is that, you know, there is always a risk if you just have that couple of factors which you put weighting on, and then you ignore these other factors, because I think there are so many ESG factors that are relevant to companies, right? So I think even if companies are in a situation where after they do that materiality assessment, and there are one or two which are very critical, so I still think you still need an overall scorecard that is more qualitative, that the RSC will have to exercise some subjective judgment over overall ESG performance. So my own view is that a combination for certain companies, maybe a combination of specific metrics and a separate ESG scorecard, but that then comes back to the trust that stakeholders have in the remuneration committees on the board. So that's why I say it always go back to governance, right? If I trust the board and the remuneration committee, I think they are really independent and they are competent, I'm quite happy to rely on their qualitative judgment of the assessment. But if I don't believe that the governance is good, I'm not going to buy qualitative assessment, right? So I think that's why I say it goes back to the quality of governance, right? Of the
Although Professor Matt, I think part of the dilemma of many corporates, especially those that are publicly listed, as you know, is that many of these rating agencies do their own assessments, whether you like it or not, right? I mean, they come in and put out a score. I mean, you know, we talked about you don't believe in just one number, but yet they do come out with a AAA or a B minus or a, they do come out with one score. And all of a sudden, many of these corporates get surprised by these ratings, right? That have been assessed, and then then they begin to react on what do we need to do to improve those scores and all that. So while I agree with you that and the conversation here that it may not be just a number, unfortunately, some of these external ratings, which by the way the investors look for, right? On what the scores are, and as a proxy, really, because they don't have any visibility. So they do rely on these rating agencies. And I think to your point, again, I'll go back to your point, the problem is the lack of consistency and common agreement on how these are looked like. So that was where I was really coming from in my question. So,
Yeah. But JP, just to jump in, I myself, right, have been involved in governance ratings, right? I started the first one in Singapore where we rate companies on governance, and now I still publish one which is on real estate investment trust, business trust in Singapore. I know companies, some of them react to that, right? But if you ask me, should they link the remuneration to the rating? I would, even though I produce some of those ratings, I say no. I mean, you will definitely to manage that you don't want to be rated very poorly, right? But so certainly you want to know how you're going to improve them. But even somebody like me who still produces those ratings, I would caution you a bit, kind of, because you then end up with gaming behavior.
Right.
Okay? When I was doing those ratings, you know how much sometimes lobbying I get from companies, who are trying to improve the ratings, and I actually try to push back on some of them, because I say if you are well governed, if you do your business well, that's what you should be worried about, right? And in fact, essentially, you should reflect well in the rating anyway. So the rating shouldn't be the end goal. It's really, at the end of the day, if you do your govern well, at the end of the day, it should be reflected in rating. Don't chase the rating for the rating's sake. And the risk that I think companies need to bear in mind, that there are all those ratings out there, and you could cherry pick any of those ratings, right? You could choose MSCI, FTSE Russell, Sustainalytics. There are so many. And depending on which one you choose, you could end up with a different assessment of performance, right?
I think if I can just add, just to your point, JP, I think for us at the boards and also for some companies, we look at this just as sort of like a sanity check and we look at some of these ratings. Sustainalytics, MSCI, CDP, they're all out there. And if we are rated low, we just want to go in and understand what are they looking at and what is it that they don't understand about the business. But for most of these rating agencies, I think they would look at your report anyway, right? Your annual report, your sustainability report, and that's where they get the information. And then if we see that there are some things which they don't quite understand, then the engagement is important. Yeah. But I agree. I mean, we wouldn't take that to link it to our remuneration, but more as a sanity check to see where we might be off or where the market may have a certain perception, which then we will need to correct. So that's where we find it useful.
Great. Okay, let me just open with a question from Julie Leong. Professor Mac, this is really insightful. I believe many companies want to follow ESG. However, they will feel that they are too small to set targets. Is full disclosure required? Can they do so at their pace? Can they be allowed to set the foundation to ensure their manpower are ready before setting targets? Again, and I'll open it to anyone in the panel.
Can I try to make an attempt? Yeah.
Sure, of course.
Yeah. I think for the SMEs, typically they are financed by the banks. So you can think of the SMEs to be like either the Scope 2 or Scope 3 contributors to the banks themselves. So ideally, the bank should step up and strategize about providing advisory services to these SMEs, which by themselves may not be able to report on their ESG disclosure, as well as, say, the large corporations, as well as the financial institutions themselves. So I think this represents an opportunity for the financial institutions actually to step in, because if they can help the SMEs to report on their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emission, that represents the Scope 3 emission for the financial institutions themselves, correct? So if I lend to a portfolio of SME companies, or even to a wholesale companies, every Scope 1, Scope 2 emission attributed to that portfolio is actually my Scope 3 emission as a financing institution. You can use that as a approximate proxy, right? So this would help them to actually assess their own data on Scope 3. So to me, this is an opportunity for the financial institutions to think about, and providing the advisory services enhances their relationship management skills as well. So perhaps during good or bad times, during the good times, the SME can remain loyal to the banks themselves. Yeah.
Thank you. YT, you want any comments?
Yeah, I think it still come back to kind of starting from the materiality assessment, right? That and I think for SMEs, again, there may be, there can be, I think you identify those factors that could end your business, right? I mean, you look at what has happened to certain companies where, because of labor issues, you have a high dependency on a customer, and the customer, because you have labor issues, the customer cuts your business and you lose 80% of your revenue and you're dead. Okay, so I think I think even for SMEs it's important, but clearly you wouldn't be as sophisticated. Maybe SMEs, I would advise that if you are, when I talk about SMEs, right, I don't know. I mean, you have SMEs and you have SMEs, right? If you are unlisted ones, then that's a different issue. You still need to think about ESG issues today. But I think if you are listed SME, I think increasingly you want to think about looking at your remuneration policy, start introducing, think about introducing long-term incentives. What we find is that in surveys that I've done on remuneration, we find that smaller companies tend to have a much greater reliance on short-term incentives. Very few of them are thinking about long-term incentives. So if you say, if you don't have, if the report, we talk about the fact, right, that one school of thought basically says that if you don't have specific ESG factors, maybe all you should do is to give more long-term incentives, because at the end of the day, right, if ESG is important for your company, the market is going to factor in how they value your company. And if you have long-term incentives, that kind of takes care of some of those ESG factors, right? So maybe for SMEs, it's more a matter of even moving the needle a little bit away from just a total reliance on short-term incentives and start bringing some long-term, putting some long-term incentives in place. But here I'm talking more about listed SMEs. I mean, for unlisted SMEs, then clearly incentives would be difficult. Yeah.
If I can add, JP. Sorry,
go ahead. I was on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, I can just add to Dr. Khoo's point. I think one is banks and financial institutions. The others are also large companies who have the SMEs as part of their supply chain. So if there's a commitment, so for example, the real estate example that I was given. So if there's a commitment for the large real estate players to say we want to move towards a climate transition plan, then we need our suppliers also to be on board. And if the suppliers includes the SMEs, then they will need to, at some point, also comply, right, with the larger players. So I think it's really if we want to drive this agenda, it's the investors, the financial institutions, the large companies will have to take the lead, and then the smaller players, I think, can see the path, how it will be relevant for them.
Yeah, I'll have to wear my one of my hats, right? And this is where I first met Dr. Mac, which is from an CHRO perspective. And Dr. Khoo mentioned it earlier in one of his remarks, and he said the younger generation, they are actually very vigilant about ESG. And actually, companies, especially SMEs, could use it as an edge for attracting talent, if they actually articulate their own purpose. What's their company's purpose, and how are they in the whole scheme of things supporting the environment or social goals. And I think what we've seen is that many of the younger generations are actually attracted by companies to do this. So again, it's one of the food for thought as well.
Yeah, and I would add that maybe larger companies do have a responsibility for helping your suppliers, right? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, we see, if you look at the Unilever, I mean, I think they need to understand that the suppliers will take some time. And the SMEs will need some time to step up. And I think they do need to help the SMEs. And it's part of being socially responsible, right? I think this idea of the Malaysian company where, I don't want to mention the name, but where the business was cut off because you have some labor issues and so on. I mean, you sometimes wonder whether that was a bit too drastic, right? From the point of view of the customer. You are a big company, you just cut off your suppliers at the knees. When you yourself in your audit are not finding anything, right? And suddenly when it's exposed, you just cut off the business. So I think that, I hope that larger companies would kind of be responsible and kind of help the SMEs. What are the things that are important to them, and give them the guidance, because they do need the guidance. They don't have the resources. Yeah.
Oh, JP, can I add on to something that both YT and Datin Norazah mentioned? I think the life cycle view of the business, the value chain, is very important, because what it means is that when you include the suppliers and even the customers, right, you can see during the pandemic lockdowns that the mindset about management, whether it's the business continuity or whether it's risk management, shifted slightly from shareholder perspective to stakeholder perspective. I think what ESG has done, if you treat the pandemic as environmentally driven, is to change the mindset from shareholders to stakeholders. And if you think about that social aspect of stakeholder relationship management, obviously it is good to help all the participants in the value chain, even in terms of them being SMEs with less maturity or capability to kind of practice ESG holistically. So I think this mindset change from looking at just shareholders to stakeholders play a large part, and of course it will influence the younger generation as well. In fact, in our current business, we encounter a lot of young entrepreneurs who feels like they want to do good. So we fund them with grants or even loans across the world, whether it's on recycling, whether it's on plastic waste removal, or even reducing carbon emission and things like that.
Great. There was a question here from Huang Tran about specific toolkits, introduction at the fundamental level. And Professor Matt there says that there may be a materials out there, but maybe also we'll pass that on to the ASEAN climate governance network. In terms of perhaps I think one of the initiatives is also to be able to put some materials or links together, really for companies to actually get the sort of like ESG 101, for lack of a better term here. I don't see any more questions. It's 4:21. We have about 9 minutes left in our time allotted. Maybe what we'll do is we'll just I'll open the floor for a couple of minutes to each one of the panelists to sort of like just give some closing thoughts on this whole topic about directors' roles in driving the climate agenda, the ESG agenda, and maybe we'll just start with you, Datin, Norazah. Maybe just some closing thoughts from you. I'll do the reverse this time. You'll be the first one, and then we'll follow with Dr. Khoo, and then we'll end with Professor Matt.
Yeah, I think just some closing thoughts would be, like I said, it's not an easy pathway to take to try and get this right. So I think we don't need to beat ourselves up too much if we are still struggling with this. The important thing, I think, is to connect and talk to more people to understand, how they've done it. And then to take that learnings to your own business, because there is no single way of doing it. Like I said, I mean, every business will have different issues, but the most important thing is to see how others have done it, and then to try to follow the logical steps. The actual factors of ESG will be different, but at least the steps, maybe there can be some learnings. So I'd say, I think the time now is awareness is there. I think we're all aware that this is important. The question now is, let's have more discussions or conversations to share practices in terms of how we actually implement this ESG agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Guan Seng?
Oh, thank you very much. I'll just follow up on Datin Norazah's point. Yeah, I think the handholding of the board is still required, because although the awareness is there, how to make them practical, how to make the strategies practical, and how to translate it into actual measures to address transition risks especially is still something that can be explored. So I guess that when they are clearer in terms of the strategies and the business model, then the co-relationship with the remuneration will be clearer. Because once you have a behavioral change, you can call it nudges along the way to transform the way they measure things, the way they manage their business in a cleaner way or something like that. Then obviously the foundation is there to relate to the actual performance going forward. But I think what we have to think about is that in this new age, we have to think beyond economic capital or economic profit. We have to think of natural capital as the P&L going forward in the future. And the natural capital will be the holistic P&L that will encompass the economic capital as well. So I think going forward, if you reward people on the natural capital preserve as well as the natural capital enhanced, then you can actually relate it to the ongoing movements to include biodiversity and the holistic natural world as well. So that could be something that needs exploration and handholding in terms of education and training going forward in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Khoo. And Professor Mack?
Yeah, I want to come back to, when I started, I said this is kind of integrating ESG into remuneration. Is part of this whole integration of ESG in the business. So I want to talk, maybe I conclude with just some of the things that I think boards need to do. Right? I mean, it's the whole process of including ensuring that the board and management have the appropriate competencies, right? Including competencies relevant to ESG. You know, I recently I made a comment about that I see many companies saying that they are going from brown to green, but I don't see much changes in the competencies, right? In terms of the management and the board. That's one. Secondly, making sure there's appropriate sustainability governance structure in place, right? We talk about corporate governance structure, right? But obviously, and I'm doing some research there now, kind of looking at the structures that are in place, and you see all sorts of models. I think at the end of the day, the question is there sufficient board oversight, right, over sustainability, or is it delegated totally to management? What is the right competencies for a chief sustainability officer, right? I think in the part one of this series, there was somebody who said you shouldn't turn the CSRO officer into a chief sustainability officer because it's not quite the same thing, right? So I think that's something to think about. Is there appropriate sustainability governance structure in place? The point that Norazah mentioned, and I also mentioned, which is the making sure you have a robust materiality assessment of ESG factors. I think that's so fundamental. And then ensuring that those ESG factors are integrated, incorporated into strategies, into actionable and appropriate goals, metrics, and targets, having appropriate company policies in place, having adequate resources. In fact, I actually, in another presentation, and there have been people have been saying we should revisit some of the ideas that maybe under a shareholder model, we have been very big on, like doing share buybacks, right? Should a company spend all its money doing share buyback, or should it be actually now thinking about investing the money for sustainable investment, right? So maybe some of these old ideas under the shareholder model, we have to rethink some of the ideas. And then, to me, considering whether to link ESG factors to executive is kind of fifth on my list, right? It's part of that whole equation. And then, of course, the board also needs to oversee a true and fair sustainability report, the preparation, because people are going to increasingly ask a lot of questions around that. Are you really telling the truth? And if you get external assurance, which is also something I'm looking at, who should undertake that external assurance, right? So those are, I think, so to me, I think of today's topic as kind of part of a broader theme of the board's role in integrating ESG into the business. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe just to close out, to everybody, again, we'd like to join me in thanking our three panelists, Professor Matt, Dr. Khoo, and Datin Norazah, really for their insights, for very openly sharing their insight, very generously sharing their experience and thoughts. I think number one. I think number two, we will share the material. Professor Mack has given permission to share his report. So we'll get back to you on that. And we'd ask Climate Governance Malaysia Secretariat if you could arrange for that to be sent to the participants. And then really, lastly, I think the learnings here is that we don't have all the answers. I think at the end of the day, the commitment to net zero by 2050, that's 28 years from now. That's still quite a ways, but we just have to make that commitment, and then together, let's figure this out. I think at the end of the day, part of the challenge is for all of us to continue to be educated. It's a fast-moving world out there in terms of developments, the metrics that are being used. There's science-based, there's TCFD, all of these acronyms really about developments around, driving this agenda. So it's really getting educated, increasing our awareness. Like I said, we're not alone. We don't have all the answers. And finally, I'll encourage you to join networks. It's really part of conversations like this that is really very important. And so finally, if you look at the chat, there is a recording that will be available on the ASEAN Climate Governance YouTube playlist within 2 days. And the next session will be on climate change and the banking sector and how will this affect my company. Even if you're not a bank, the whole point is, what will that do to your company because of these changes to the banking sector, and how they look now at their own funding and financing, as was already alluded to. That will be on the 2nd of August at 3 p.m. Again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to all our speakers. Have a great day ahead.